18a Yud Ches of an Aleph. But let's go over what we did yesterday. The Mishnah began with a person whose relative passed away. They are putter, they are exempt from positive commandments. And it specifically mentions Kriya Shema and Tefillin, and it says all mitzvahs. And the exemption had to do with the fact that they are busy. They are busy with the Tarud b'machshavas k'vurasa, Rashi says. They are engrossed, they are involved in dealing with the thought, with the burial, and therefore they are exempt from all mitzvahs. Now, the Mishnah continued and talked about those that are carrying the coffin or the mita, the item that the deceased is on to the burial. Those that are carrying it, it mentioned there's a difference between the ones that are in front, the ones that are that have carried it, or that haven't carried it yet or have carried it already. At least according to Rashi, the way Rashi learned, the ones that carried it already don't have the exemption of Shema, but the ones that didn't carry it yet, they have the exemption of Shema. And the understanding, the simple understanding of Rashi is, well, they did, if those that already did their mitzvah, carrying it, so they're not exactly concerned about the burial, because they sort of feel like they've accomplished their mitzvah. At least on a surface level, that would be the simple explanation of Rashi. They've carried it already once. So even if they're going to be needed later, they don't feel they feel like they've done already something for the deceased, and they are exempt. I did mention yesterday there is another explanation in Rashi, and that is that they are not going to be needed to carry it anymore, but they are needed to participate in the burial. So such a person is not exempt from Shema. Again, we're trying to explain why would those that carried it already, why would they be exempt? Why would they not be exempt from Shema if they're needed? The way Rashi understands the wording in the Mishnah is that even if they're needed, if they already carried the coffin, even if they're going to be needed later, they're obligated to say Shema. And that seems a little surprising, because if they're going to be needed, you would think that they should be exempt from Shema, just like those that never carried the coffin yet. And so the commentaries try to figure out an explanation for Rashi. Yes, Robert.
I just have a question. I'm starting to read it in fully integrated, but just, is there any kind of hierarchy for those who are mourning relative doing mitzvot or responsibilities and dealing with the deceased one?
So you're wondering, like, the different categories of,
right, like your father,
people.
A brother, a mother, cousin, anything like that behooves that individual as a primary mourner, or are
Right.
people co-mourners and stuff like that? I'm just want to understand.
Yes. So there's 7 relatives that a person is obligated to they're officially the ones that are mourning, and that's the mother, father, sister, brother, son, daughter, and spouse.
Okay.
And so basically the responsibility for burial is what we're dealing with here.
Okay.
Afterwards, they deal with those people are the ones who mourn the Shiva. But before the Shiva, we're dealing with the mitzvah of burial. And that's what we're dealing with here, because they're involved they need to be involved in the burial and burial arrangements. And so those are the 7 that we're dealing with. That Misha Mesa Mutal Lefanav, excuse me, the first words of this chapter refers to someone whose relative, meaning he's one of those 7, whose relative is placed in front of him, which the Gemara will explain what that means. But basically, it's his relative or her relative that passed away. One of those 7. Yes,
Thank you.
Susan. Sure.
Rabbi, the people that are carrying the stretcher, are they always related to the deceased, or are they strangers?
Strangers.
But they're Jewish, right?
Yes, Jewish people who are supposed to generally say the Shema, but here we're discussing if they are going to be obligated to say Shema. If they weren't Jewish, they would not need to say Shema
Okay.
in the first
But they're
place.
strangers. They're
They're,
not the
they're
ones
strangers, right?
mourning. They're not
Right,
the
they're
ones
not the ones
mourning.
mourning. In fact,
Okay.
according to tradition, relatives don't carry the coffin. If there are enough Jewish people at the burial, you don't have relatives carrying the coffin. It's
There's no
tradition.
exception. There's
Excuse
no
me?
exceptions. In other words, if there's not enough Jewish people, then what happens?
If there's not enough Jewish people, if I'm not mistaken, even relatives would carry
Okay.
the coffin because
Okay.
it would maybe be a dishonor for the
Okay.
deceased that the community doesn't carry, that his own people. I'm not 100% sure. I have to look that up, but for sure, if there are enough people, the tradition is you don't have the children don't carry the coffin. That's the
Okay.
common tradition that I've seen.
I have firsthand experience with that. That's why I'm asking you.
Okay.
Okay.
So the Mishnah continued. So this was Rashi's explanation, and the way his wording of the Mishnah went. Of course, I mentioned to you that there's another wording in the Mishnah, and that's how Tosfos learns that it all depends on if you're needed or not needed. If you are going to be needed, it doesn't matter if you carried yet or didn't carry yet. A person who's going to be needed is exempt from saying Shema. And a person who's not going to be needed is not exempt, whether they carried it or they didn't carry it. If they didn't carry it yet, but they're not going to be needed to carry it, they are not exempt from Shema. They have to recite the Shema. But we did say both of them are exempt from Tefillah, because Tefillah davening Shemona Esrei, the Amidah, the praying, the main part of the prayer, they are exempt from because the rabbis exempted them. It's a rabbinic obligation to recite that prayer, and they are exempt. We did mention that Rashi brings down an opinion that they're it doesn't mean that they're fully exempt. It means that they are exempt in the meantime because they will have time later to recite the prayer. But Rashi wasn't satisfied with that. He said it doesn't fit in the words, and that was the law regarding those carrying the coffin. Okay, then came after the burial, the law that the Mishnah dealt with was should they recite the Shema before they actually do the consolation, which is done at the cemetery. There's a certain consolation that was done called the Shura, the row, that they would line up in rows, and the Mishnah tells us that if they were able to finish the Shema, to start it and finish it before the mourner or before the mourner arrives, before they are going to be actively involved in this consolation in the row, they would be, if they can finish it, they should say it. If not, they shouldn't start it. And then we said those that are in the row, the inner ones are exempt, the outer ones are not exempt. So that's this is the case in the Mishnah. Now, it's not that we don't exactly do it the same way, the burial as they did it then. We don't do these rows where the mourner stands in one place and everyone stands in rows and wishes their condolences. But the Mishnah tells us that there are cases where they're obligated and there are cases where they're not, and it depends if they would be able to recite the Shema or finish it or not. The Gemara then mentioned that we have a brisa. A brisa is a statement of the rabbis of the Mishnah, but it wasn't edited into a Mishnah, so it was left as a as an article of the Tanoim, the authors of the Mishnah. It was a essay from them, a statement, a halachic statement from them, but it was not edited into the Mishnah. It wasn't accepted in the Mishnah, but it's still a valid statement, an authoritative statement. And the Gemara often brings down such statements. They're called brisas. And the brisa, we normally try to make sure that everything flows and it fits with the Mishnayos, that there's not a contradiction. And this is what our Gemara is bothered with, because our Mishnah implied only if the exemption of Shema and all mitzvahs is if a person's relative is right there in front of them. And the brisa implies that even if the deceased, the relative who passed away is not there in front of the person, the brisa implies that they are even in that case, the person called the oinen, the person who's in the grieving process of his relative who just passed away, he is exempt. Now, I mentioned to you that there's two parts of mourning. There's the person whose relative was not buried yet. That's called an oinen. And after the burial, it's called shiva. So there's the oinen part and then the shiva part. The oinen is before the burial, and the shiva is after the burial. I should clarify and say that the oinen, there's a biblical part of oinen and a rabbinic part of oinen. Oinen is this person whose relative did not get buried yet. The biblical part of oinen is the first day, if the burial did not take place on the first day. So the first day, the person is biblically an oinen. And after that, the rabbinic oinen kicks in, and until the burial, he's rabbinically has the laws of oinen. If the burial took place on the first day, so of course the biblical oinen takes place and it lasts a full day. So there's opinions about the night. Is the night even after the burial? It could be that the person's called an oinen, which is an interesting law. I mean, it's not so common for the burial to be the first day. Often, it has to be pushed off for a day. But according to, there are cases, we were learning earlier in Tractate Brochos about Rebbe Gamliel, how they spoke to him about taking, he bathed, and it was, they speak about if the burial happened that day, and they talk about him being an oinen. So the oinen is at least a day biblically, and then afterwards it's rabbinic until the burial. Okay, so that's the laws of oinen, and the Gemara, as I mentioned, was asking this contradiction: does the deceased have to be there, or even if the deceased is in another city, would the person still be called an oinen and be exempt? Now, the question that commentaries deal with here is the exemption from reciting brachos. What happens if you would want to say a bracha? Are you allowed to? Is this a prohibition of reciting brachos, or is this a exemption from reciting brachos? So if you look in Rashi on page Yud Zayin Amud Beis, Rashi on page 17b, on the bottom Rashi, he says, Einoi tzarech levarech berachos hamazon. He doesn't need to say the grace after meal. And if you look at the previous Rashi, ve'enoi tzarech levarech berachos hamoitzi, he doesn't need to recite the hamoitzi. So what it sounds like from Rashi is he is exempt, but maybe if he wanted to, he would be allowed to. Yes, Yehuda.
Yeah, I think we learned this previously, that with a person who just got married is exempt on his wedding day, but if he wants to say it, he can.
So very, very, very good. You're remembering that, Yehuda. It was an argument among the rabbis. Does it look like he's showing off if he recites the Shema on his wedding night? because is he implying like he can have kavana even though most people can't, and he's so spiritual he's able to concentrate and recite the Shema with concentration, even though most people, their mind would be on the mitzvah that they're about to fulfill of, being with their new wife, and maybe they wouldn't be able to concentrate. And he's saying that he could. So there was an opinion in the Gemara that he. Talmud, Mishnah, that in the Mishnah, if he's allowed to say the Shema or not allowed to, and the point that you're making is a very good point. That the same would seem to be applicable here. That maybe it would depend. It would depend on if he could have kavana or not, and if it would be the same argument. Does it look like he's claiming that he's able to have concentration even though most people wouldn't be able to? In other words, is he showing off or not? So your point is correct, actually, Yehuda, that according to Rashi, the way the commentaries understand it, would the person whose relative passed away, would he be allowed to say Shema? It would be based on the same argument if a chassan is allowed to say Shema, if a groom is allowed to say Shema. It would be based on the same thing. Now, where Rashi says you don't have to, say the Hamoitzi or the Berchas Hamazon, this is a different law. This is that you could, if you wanted to, you could recite the Hamoitzi, the blessing on the bread, in the Berchas Hamazon, the grace after meals. That would be a different law because that's not connected to concentration. So just to summarize, Rashi over here, what I was bringing out was that when it comes to certain blessings, according to Rashi, a person would be allowed to recite those blessings. However, Shema would be based on an argument that we mentioned earlier, like Yehuda brought about, that regarding Shema, that would be based on this argument. Would someone say Shema or not? According to Rashi, could they say it if they want to? It could be based on that same argument about a groom. Would they be allowed to say Shema if they want to or not? Now, we don't paskin this way. The halacha follows the way Tosfos understands it, and that is that you're not allowed to recite brachos. The rabbis prohibited you to recite brachos. And how could the rabbis do such a thing? Especially grace after meal, which is a blessing that's biblical. How could the rabbis remove that, tell you not to recite it if it's a biblical blessing? Now, the law of Einan biblically would say that if you're involved in a mitzvah, you're exempt from another mitzvah. But if you could push yourself and do both, do both. But the rabbi said, no, don't do it. You are not allowed to recite the brachas. So again, this is an argument, Rashi and Tosfos over here, that Rashi says if you want to say brachas, you could, you don't have to. And Tosfos says, no, you're not allowed to. And the halacha follows Tosfos that you wouldn't be in the, how did the rabbis do that and tell you you're not allowed to recite brachas? And this is when a person's relative just passed away and they're not supposed to recite brachas or say the Shema, put on tefillin. They're called an einan. They're not allowed to recite. They're not supposed to recite brachas. The rabbis did that because the rabbis have a power to tell you, shave v'al taseh, sit and don't do a positive mitzvah. They're not allowed to tell you to transgress a negative mitzvah, but they can tell you, do not go and transgress, do not go and fulfill a positive mitzvah. They have the ability. It's called, the chachamim have the koyach, yesh koyach b'yad chachamim. The chachamim have the power to say, shave v'al, to tell you not to do a mitzvah, b'shave v'al taseh, not to do a commandment and just sit and don't do it. So the rabbis have that ability. And what is the reason? Why did the rabbis?
I have to ask you,
established such a thing. I mean, why would the rabbis tell you don't do this? Why would they? So now we've established they could tell you such a thing. The rabbis have the ability to, not just your rabbi can tell you that. I'm talking about a consensus of rabbis got together from the time of the Talmud or earlier, and they established this law that a oinen is not allowed to recite brachos. I'm not talking about a few rabbis get together nowadays and decide they make their own laws. This is not, they don't have the ability. But the yesh kayach biad chachamim, I'm talking about a consensus of the greatest scholars. They have the ability to make such a command. Shevi al tas. I'll give you an example. The example could be in the time of Purim. They fasted for 3 days. In the miracle of Purim, before the miracle, Mordechai and Esther, Esther came up with this idea that they should fast for 3 days, and Mordechai agreed to it, and he got the rabbis to agree to it. They should fast for 3 days. Do you know when those 3 days were? Those 3 days were included the night of Passover, the Seder. Means that they did not eat matzah or drink the 4 cups of wine on the Seder night. How did they do that? Because yesh koyach biyad chachamim, the chachamim have the ability to establish such a rule to say do not fulfill the biblical commandment. So the question is, why did they do that? What do you think? Why would the rabbis make such a rule for an oinen that they're not allowed to recite brachos?
Good question.
Hello?
Anyone? Any thoughts?
Hello? Rabbi, hello?
Yeah, yeah.
What about Tehillim?
Uh-huh.
What about it?
Isn't the body supposed to be comforted when it's nifter? I mean, the nevela is supposed to be comforted by the Tehillim, during the services.
I'm not sure. Thank God I don't know these laws inside out. Baruch Hashem. Very blessed that Baruch Hashem, li ayin harath. I don't know the laws. I shouldn't need to. No one should ever need to know these laws. But if you want to know about Tehillim, I'm not sure. Let me just take a look here. If it mentions it right here, I have this great book on the laws of mourning, but it doesn't mention Tehillim in the index. So I'm not sure about reciting Tehillim. I'll have to look it up later. Good question. In any event, why would the rabbis prohibit people from reciting brachos and from saying the Shema, putting tefillin on? So there are 2 explanations in the Talmud Yerushalmi, and one of them is that the honor of the deceased takes a priority, and in order to show honor to the deceased,
Takes precedence. Is that what you mean? The honor that you
the
are
honor for the deceased, the rabbi said this will be in order to honor the deceased, no brachas and no mitzvahs should be fulfilled. And the second reason is because the deceased has no one to carry his burden. So these are the 2 reasons. It's for his honor, or to make sure that everything that's necessary will be done. And the Talmud Yerushalmi says, so what is the difference between these 2 reasons? So if it's because of the honor of the deceased, that, in other words, they should be available, they should be concentrating on the deceased, their mind should be on the deceased. So according to that reason, even if someone is taking care of the burial, they still are exempt and should not be reciting brachas because it's an honor for as an honor for the deceased. Their mind should be on the deceased. The other reason that there is no one to carry his burden, according to that reason, if someone is taking care of all the arrangements and it's all set, that would be a reason why the person who's the relative who's not taking care of anything, doesn't need to be taking care of anything, they should be now obligated in fulfilling mitzvahs because their exemption no longer applies because there is someone who's taking care of all the burden. Now, one of the cases where this one of the different the halacha follows. Well, we'll see in the next Gemara. I didn't mention it now, but we mentioned it yesterday about what happens on Shabbos. So that's going to be a area of question. If it does on Shabbos, they're not going to be involved in the burial. So would the relatives be exempt on Shabbos because they're not doing anything as far as arrangements are concerned? Or do we say that maybe there are some arrangements that can be done on Shabbos? Another question would be, what happens if the relatives are not going to the funeral and they've already given the body to the Chevra Kadisha and there's no more arrangements that need to be made, and they're not even going to be involved in the funeral. They sent the body to Israel, let's say. So that would be a case where they've really given over everything to the Chevra Kadisha. Now, the idea that everything is given over to the Chevra Kadisha, that itself is not enough. It also has to involve that the relative is not going to the funeral. Because if the relative is going to the funeral, that means that not everything has been done regarding the deceased. If they're not even going to the funeral and they gave the body over and everything has been arranged, so that's when you would say, well, there's no more for them to do, and it's brought in Shulchan Aruch that would be a case where they would be obligated in fulfilling the mitzvahs. What happens if one of the relatives is taking care of everything? So would the other relatives be allowed to rely on that relative and say, I want to do some of them, I want to do the mitzvahs. So there's arguments between the halachic opinions. The Ramah in Shulchan Aruch implies that it would be prohibited to do mitzvahs even in such a case, but there is a famous opinion of the Rav Yah who says that because the reason is, one of the reasons in Yerushalmi is that there's no one to carry his burden, and here you have someone who's carrying his burden, together with the reason of Rashi that says that you're only you're not obligated, you're exempt from mitzvahs, but if you want, you could. So if you combine those two reasons together, he says, therefore, we should allow someone whose one relative is taking care of the burial. We should allow the others to recite brachas. In other words, if you rely on these two reasons together, the reason of the Yerushalmi that there is someone who can carry his burden, and Rashi who says that you're exempt from brachas, but if you want, you could. So in other words, would we allow someone to recite brachas? And this would be an argument between the Rav Yah and the Ramah. Probably the opinion follows the Ramah because he's the father of all Ashkenazic Jewry. And so basically In that case, it would seem that people would not, the relatives would not recite brachas, even though they have one of the relatives is sort of making the arrangements. Okay, so now we're going to continue. So that was the question that our Gemara was asking, was from this brisa, and I got a little sidetracked. We were talking about brachas, but the question still remains as far as, does the deceased have to be in front of the relative to be exempt from Shema and from all mitzvahs, or does it not matter if the deceased is there? And the brisa, the entirety of the brisa, it started off mentioning about eating, and it said that if the deceased is in front of the relative, then the relative is not allowed to eat in that house or in that room. He should go to somewhere else. If he doesn't have another place to go, he should put a mechitza, a partition. If he doesn't have a partition, he should turn his face, and he's not allowed to eat meat or drink wine or recline. He doesn't recite these brachas. Rashi says he doesn't have to. Taisa says he's not allowed to recite the brachas, and they don't include him in the zimun. In fact, it's brought in Shulchan Aruch that he's not even counted for a minyan. If a person's relative passed away, they're not allowed to say the daven, and they're not allowed to say Shema and so on. And they can't be counted. If they're not allowed to daven, then they can't be counted for a minyan. They are exempt from all these mitzvahs, but on Shabbos, they recline, they eat meat, they drink wine, they recite brachas, they do the zimun. They're obligated in all mitzvahs. That's on Shabbos. From Shimon ben Gamliel says if they're obligated in these, they're obligated in all of them, in all mitzvahs. So that would be on Shabbos. It seems like the first opinion said they're obligated in all mitzvahs, and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says they're obligated in all mitzvahs. So the Gemara asks, what is the difference between these two opinions? If they're on Shabbos, they're obligated in all mitzvahs. Everyone seems to follow that. And what was the Gemara's answer?
Say again, Rabbi.
There was two opinions, but they both seem to be saying the same thing. The first opinion said that they're on Shabbos, the relative of a deceased is obligated in all mitzvahs. And the second opinion, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, said the same thing. He said because they're obligated in these mitzvahs, they're obligated in all mitzvahs, and it would seem like both opinions say they're obligated in all mitzvahs. So the Gemara asks, so what's the difference? And Rabbi Yochanan asked this question. He says, so what's the difference between these two opinions? And he answers, the difference is regarding having, what?
Tashmish Amita.
Tashmish Amita. It's regarding having relations, would a man be obligated to fulfill his obligation to his wife, which is called Aina, the time to be with his wife? Would he be obligated in that, or is he exempt from that? And Reb Shimon, according to Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, he's even obligated in that mitzvah. According to the Tanakama, the first opinion is he's either exempt from it or he's prohibited from it. But that would be the other, the Tanakama. Now, the Gemara now explains the contradiction. It says the Mishnah said only if the deceased is in front of him, and is he exempt? And this brisa implies no matter what the situation is, he's exempt. So the Gemara answers, the first answer, what we did yesterday was that even the brisa is also only talking about if the deceased is in front of him. And if you read the brisa, there are two ways of reading it. And the Gemara, the first answer of the Gemara, Rav Papa, he says that's how to read it, is that you read the Gemara saying that you read the brisa that if the deceased is in front of him and he turns his face and eats, he's also not allowed to say brachos. So it's continuation of the first statement that the deceased is there in front of him. It's talking about a case where he did not go to another house or didn't go to another room or didn't put up a partition. And in that case, he's exempt from all mitzvahs. This is the first opinion. This is not the halacha, of course. Rav Ashi Amar. So now we're going to start from the next opinion, and this is Rav Ashi, which is the first word on the line. We're about 12 lines down from the top of the page 18a. Rav Ashi Amar. Rav Ashi says, "Kivan shemutal olav l'kovroi kemutal lefanav dami." Rav Ashi says that really the law is that the relative is exempt in all cases. And the reason why it uses the word that the deceased is placed in front of him, it means it's placed in front of him to bury, meaning it's on his shoulders. The deceased is placed in front of him doesn't mean physically, it means a more, not literally, but in the sense of responsibility, the deceased is in front of him, in a sense that he's responsible to bury. Mutal olav kivan kolzman. Let me read it again. Kivan shemutal olav l'kovrei, since it is placed upon him to bury him, to bury the deceased. Kemutal lefanav dami. It's as if the deceased is placed in front of him. Shenemar, as it says, Vayakam Avraham me'al pnei meisai. Avraham got up from before his deceased, his wife, Sarah. V'nemar, and it says afterwards, V'ekbara meisi milfanai, and I will bury my deceased from before me. But what does that mean? The deceased, he got up already from her. Why is he saying she is before me? Why is Avraham saying, I will bury my deceased from before me? She's not in front of him. He got up already first from her, and he went to go find out about buying a certain plot. So why is Avraham saying she's before me? So you see that that's a term used that kolzman shemutal olav l'kovroi, as long as it is placed upon him to bury, kemutal lefanav dami, it is as it is placed before him, it is considered. It is considered as if the deceased is placed before him. So that's the conclusion of this contradiction, of answering we've now answered the contradiction, the question, and what it comes out is that the deceased does not have to be right there. It could be in a different place, a different city even maybe. And as long as it's he's responsible, he's dealing with the burial, as long as it's sort of on his shoulders, that would be the exemption. And it doesn't necessarily mean that he's the one making all the opinions, but it's still a burden on the relatives. He's one of the relatives that it would be a burden upon. Now, the Gemara continues and says, Mesu in, the Gemara says, Mesoi in. The Gemara is now asking that the exemption from all the mitzvahs is that only apply to someone's relative that passed away? What about the shomer? What about the person who is not a relative, but he's doing the watching of the body, which is one of the traditions that is done after a person passes away, is they have a shomer. And even if the burial is not going to be for a few days, generally the Chevra Kadisha, each of the funeral homes, they will offer an option if a person wants someone to stay there with the body, and they're called a shomer, and they have like 12-hour shifts until the burial. And so the question is that shomer supposed to take breaks and daven, or should they not take breaks? Is the person who's the shomer, what is their responsibility with regard to their own obligations and mitzvahs? So the Gemara asks, Mesoi in, his deceased, his relative, in, yes, he's exempt. Aval meshamroi, but a person who's a shomer, who's watching him, loy, he's not exempt. V'hatanyo, but didn't we study in a baraisa? Again, a baraisa is a statement from the rabbis of the Mishnah that wasn't edited into the Mishnah? Didn't we learn in a brisa that says Hamashamer es hameis, if a person is a shomer, is a watcher for the deceased, he's watching the deceased, aval pi she'enoi mesoi, even though it's not his relative, but he is a shomer. Potter mikriyashma umenat tefillah umenat tefillin, he is exempt from Shema, from tefillah, and from tefillin. Shema, tefillah is prayer, and tefillin, the phylacteries, he is exempt from these mitzvahs. Umikol mitzvahs amoris b'Torah, and from all mitzvahs that it mentions in the Torah. So the Mishnah implied only if a person's relative passed away, but really the law seems to be even a shomer. So the Gemara says, Mishamroi afal pi she'enoi mesoi. The shomer is exempt even if it's not his relative. And mesoi afal pi she'enoi mishamroi, it's his relative, even if he's not a shomer, even if he's not the shomer. So the Gemara is concluding that there are two exemptions. One is a shomer, and one is a relative. That the relative would be exempt even if he's not watching, which makes me think that the Gemara's question was, doesn't he have to be watching also? Here we see that the watching person is the one who's exempt, so maybe he has to be watching, and the Gemara's answer is no, watching even if he's not his relative, and relative even if he's not watching. So I think that, does anyone have the English? Is that the way they explain it in the English? That what was the question? Was the question, doesn't he have to be watching? Is that how you see the question, anyone?
I have one citation and I don't know if I'm reading it correctly. Do you want me to read it?
Just give me 1 second. Let's see. I'm going to look over here. I have a, let's see. I have the art scroll here.
Yeah, I have the art scroll too, and it's 18A2.
Yeah. So, but here it says, from the Mishnah it emerges that yes, someone whose own dead relative requires burial is exempt, but the Mishnah implies someone who is simply guarding without being a relative of deceased is not exempt. And no, so he doesn't learn it that way. Interesting. The first way I translate is the way they translate it here. It's interesting. Okay. I'm just seeing another way to read it, which seems to flow a little better. Again, the first way I read it was that the Gemara is surprised that the Mishnah only mentioned his relative, and the Mishnah doesn't mention a shomer. That's, that the Gemara is asking, what about a shomer? Isn't the shomer also exempt? And so the Gemara's answer is, yeah, but the shomer doesn't have to be a relative. Here we're talking about a relative. He's not a shomer and he's exempt. In other words, it's sort of like two separate cases. And why didn't the Mishnah mention it? It doesn't really say clearly. It's just saying that the Mishnah, is talking about the relative and not someone who's doing something. He's just a relative. So it's sort of like in a different category. Maybe that's why. The second way I was reading it was maybe the Gemara is asking, does he have to be a relative? Doesn't he have to be watching it? And the Gemara's answer is no. If he's a relative, he doesn't have to be watching it. The watching person is a person of his own, and the relative. But I don't want to argue with the art scroll. If the art scroll learns it the first way I said it, then that's the way we'll do it. Okay. So now the Gemara says that basically you have two people who are exempt. You have the relative and you have a shomer. The shomer is exempt. Now, the Gemara asks, what about a person who's in the cemetery? Isn't he exempt? Mesai umashamra in, if it's his relative who passed away and a shomer, in, yes, they are exempt. Aval mahalach bebeis hakvaros loy, but if they are walking in the beis hakvaros loy, they're not exempt. Vihatanya, didn't we learn in a brisa? A person should not go in the cemetery with tefillin b'reishai, with tefillin on his head, the sefer Torah b'zraya, and a Torah scroll in his arm, the koirei, and read it. Vim isakain, and if he does such a thing, he's transgressing the commandment that it says in Mishlei, transgressing this statement that it says in Mishlei, that it says loyeg larosh, a person who mocks the poor. Cheref oisehu is blaspheming his creator, and it implies from that verse that being that the people deceased are not able to fulfill mitzvahs, they're called the rush, they're called poor. And if a person does mitzvahs in front of them, like in a cemetery, they would be considered to be mocking the poor because they're fulfilling a mitzvah in a cemetery, and they are cheref oisehu, they are blaspheming God because they are
They're not showing
not
proper honor.
What'd you say?
They're not showing proper honor.
Respect, honor for the deceased. I'm sure there must be deeper explanations why it's considered blasphemy, but it's maybe not accepting the way Hashem created the world, that that the deceased can't fulfill mitzvahs. I'm sure there must be some deeper explanations. I'll have to take a look if there's different insights that must be in the it's called the Agoda, the Agadic part of the Talmud has a number of commentaries on it. So, but basically the term is commonly used, loyeg larosh, the laws of being respectful to the deceased in not embarrassing them, that they can't do certain things and we can. So it's called loyeg larosh, mocking the poor. So the law is that a person is not allowed to do these things in front of in a cemetery. So according to that, the Gemara is asking, so is it only these few cases where we are exempt from doing these mitzvahs? In a cemetery, a person's also exempt. So the Gemara answers, and it says, Hasam toichar ba'amais hu da'aser. In a cemetery, within the 4 amos, you're not allowed to do mitzvahs or recite, study Torah, put tefillin on, and have a read from the Sefer Torah. But outside of the 4 amos, outside of the 4 cubits, which is 6 to 8 feet, he would be allowed to. Hasam toichar ba'amais hu da'aser, chutz la'arba amos chayiv. Within 4 amos, it's prohibited. Outside of 4 amos, toichar ba'amais hu da'aser, chutz la'arba amos. But outside of the 4 amos chayiv, he would be obligated to fulfill those mitzvahs. And
the 4 amot is measured from where?
Well, the simple reading would be from the grave.
From the grave.
Yeah. Now, I'm not sure how this fits because in Shulchan Aruch, if I remember correctly, tefillin is a big problem to put on anywhere inside what's called a cemetery. Now, if that area is called a cemetery, even if you have a space of 8 feet, if I remember correctly, it's prohibited to do tefillin. So it could be that the halacha doesn't follow this exact statement of the 4 amos regarding tefillin. I'm not sure. I have to see why that is. Why does tefillin carry with it a stricter stricter law. Yes.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
you're talking about an individual. I mean, but if you're in a cemetery, you're surrounded by graves. So
Yeah,
when
but
you're
there are
talking about,
streets. You could be in a cemetery and there's a street that you could have, you could theoretically, have an area where there's 8 feet on all sides. You could also be a cemetery where they haven't filled up all the graves. So you have in between graves, you have areas that are in between graves,
so as long as you're away from graves, you could do all those things.
That's what it seems like from this Gemara. Again, I don't think this is the halacha regarding tefillin. Let me pull out, I have a, let me see if it pulls this. I have a Gemara that brings the halachas. Let me just see if it mentions it here. Tefillin, it's prohibited to enter Beis HaKvaros or within 4 amos of a mace with tefillin. So in other words, the 4 amos apply not in a cemetery. The 4 amos apply if there's a deceased somewhere, but it's not a cemetery. But in a cemetery, you're not even allowed to enter. If there's tefillin or within 4 amos of a mace, of tefillin on his head because of leg larash, if they are covered, it would be permissible. And even to hold them in his hand is prohibited within 4 amos of a kever. So you're not allowed to even hold them within 4 amos of a grave. And even the ritzuos, even the straps have to be covered.
So in other words, if you put them in your tefillin bag, you can carry them.
The tefillin bag seems okay if they're,
but exposed, the answer is no.
Right, exposed wouldn't be allowed. Now, Memdalit, even though it's supposed to need to be covered. Yep, and then it says Kriyashman Tefillah within 4 amos of a mace, prohibited to say Shema within 4 amos of a mace, or in a cemetery. And if he read it, he did not fulfill his obligation, which would mean if he would have to go outside and recite Shema again.
So that means even if there's a street in the cemetery, you wouldn't fulfill your obligation.
Oh, so this is the question. So now he jumps to the next thing. He says, within a Beis HaKvaros, when you're not next to 4 amos within 4 cubits, which is like 6 to 8 feet of a grave, some are machmir, some people are machmir, and this is the Magen Avram. And the Taz writes, even though it's clear that it's only within 4 amos, but the Torah and Shulchan Aruch say as a like a fence, the person should be careful as a fence around this law. It's good to be careful even outside of 4 amos in a Beis HaKvaros, lest he come close to 4 amos of a grave. Nevertheless, this is only a preferable thing. The Eved, if you were outside of 4 amos of the grave and the time came to say Shema, you need to recite it. And so writes the Taz that in a Beis HaKvaros outside of Daled Amos, even though it's Asr L'Chatchila, preferably it's prohibited to say Shema there. Nevertheless, with the Eved, you fulfilled your obligation. That is the Taz. I don't know if everyone agrees. Again, the Rambam had said that a person didn't fulfill his obligation. The Ravid says you fulfill it b'di'evid, and the Achronim say we should follow the Rambam regarding Shema. A person should recite it again. Regarding Shemona Esrei, a person doesn't need to recite it again. Birchas Kriya Shema, there's a question, and then we have this Magen Avram that says that a person should be careful even anywhere in the Beis HaKvaros, and then the Taz seems to explain that this is only lechatchila and not b'di'evid. In other words, after the fact, person If he's not within 4 amos, it's not a problem. Let me continue. Lahalacha be'emtza, in the middle of a beis hakvaros, even if you're in the middle of a cemetery, even if there's space, you should be machmir. But at the end, you should be more stringent and not fulfill any mitzvah, even if you have space of 8 feet, 6 to 8 feet. You should, if you're in the middle of the cemetery, don't do it. But at the end of the cemetery, that there's no graves there, so it's only set aside for graves. You don't have to be careful because the main law is the 4 amos, and it's proper not to enter at all with tefillin on one's head within the walls of the beis hakvaros, lest you come close to a grave without realizing. Now, with regard to Kaddish that we say, and obviously we're not so machmer. I see here he brings 2 opinions, but obviously if anyone's ever gone to a funeral, I mean, they're generally, it's impossible to separate, 8 feet from a grave. So obviously we are lenient. Now, a person regarding a Sefer Torah in a grave in a cemetery, person should not hold a Sefer Torah and enter a beis hakvaros, even if it's wrapped and with its covering, with its cloth covering. And a person should not read it until he goes 4 amos away from a mace or from a beis hakvaros. And you're not allowed to say their Torah by heart, only if it's to honor the deceased. So that would be the only exemption. Okay.
Rabbi, why would anyone take a Sefer Torah into the cemetery?
Well, there are a lot of yeshivas that they have like near a cemetery. They want to be near a grave of like their tzaddik, their Rosh Yeshiva, so it's not uncommon to have such a thought. You want to have a yeshiva near the grave. I believe one of the Gerer Rebbes is buried right outside of their yeshiva in Yerushalayim. And I guess it's obviously a very holy place, and you might have a thought to make to use it as a place to daven, and the law is, and you study Torah there and so on, and the conclusion is that no, that's not the appropriate thing, because it would be mocking the deceased. Yes.
Yes. Does the halachot apply to the Kohanim as well, with regards to the 4 amot?
So
they can't enter the cemetery at all.
The Kohen.
No, I understand that, but outside an open area.
Right. You're wondering if there's any exemption of entering if there's if there is a space that there's no graves. Would you be allowed to go in within the walls of the cemetery? Honestly, I don't know. I'm guessing not. I know we tell a Nazir not to go anywhere near a cemetery. I'm guessing a Kohen would be in the same category, and it's similar to this, that we say you shouldn't even wear tefillin, anywhere, even outside. So I'm guessing a Kohen would probably be similar, but I don't know. Not sure if there's any exemption. I know we generally bury Kohanim by the wall so that the relatives can stand outside. If I'm not mistaken, that's what I was always told, that the Kohanim are buried by by the entrance so that the relatives can stand outside. So I'm not sure. Is anyone a Kohen here that's familiar with this? We don't have any Kohanim.
I've heard the same thing from my friends that are Kohanim, that they're buried, by the boundary of the cemetery, so that if they stand, I guess, Aba'amot outside of the boundary, then they can participate but not be physically in the cemetery as well.
Right. In other words, the wall creates a separation that they're not considered within four amos, within 4 cubits. Yes, Ben. Ben.
I know my friend that is a Cohen, his parents were buried, but not close to the fence.
Uh-huh.
But he was parked outside the cemetery next to the fence.
Uh-huh. So
He
he
did
didn't
not
go
go in.
in. Right. Uh-huh. So it could be
But
that
I'm saying his
cemetery.
parents were very far from the fence.
Well, because maybe they didn't have any space anymore. You know, could be it was filled up.
Right.
He had no
Maybe
choice.
what he bought, whatever grave they bought, yeah.
So it could be they bought it years ago and they had no choice. Or it could be the cemetery was a
Right.
certain size and then they
they
added to the
expanded.
cemetery and they bought a new piece of land and added it to the cemetery. It could be, you never know. I don't know. It's a good,
Yeah, I don't know.
Right, right. So, so that basically talks of the, that covers the law. So conclusion from the way it sounds in these, what they're bringing from Shulchan Aruch is that inside a cemetery, even if you have Dalet Amos, even if you have four cubits, you can't put tefillin on over there. But if you're at the end of the cemetery, they say you could be lenient. In other words, it's almost like not considered part of the cemetery, even though the wall of the cemetery it's part of. But if you're 4 amos away and it's at the end, so it's not really officially part of the cemetery, it seems like that would be a leniency, at least for tefillin. Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
Thank you.
Oh, it's 11 o'clock. Wow.
Thank you,
Okay.
Rabbi.
Yeah. Have,
Bye, Mr. Rabbi. Take it
have a
easy.
great day, everyone. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Sei gesund.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.